Welcome. We're so pleased that you've come to be a part of our class today. We hope you'll want to be a part of our class every Sunday. We're working our way through the Gospel of Mark. We're just about halfway through the Gospel of Mark, so we're going to move along fairly quickly here and get on to Luke and John. I've already read those two commentaries, and I've really enjoyed them, been blessed by them, and I think you will as well. We'll shift to a different author each book, as you know, so that you get a little different perspective. The scholar we're using for Mark is Dr. Famie Perkins. She teaches at the Roman Catholic Seminary and College at Boston College. Is very well respected as a scholar, and I thought she would bring a little different perspective, being female and at a Roman Catholic school. And yet we Protestants celebrate her many talents and the wonderful work that she's done. Mark is her thing, you know, Gospel of Mark. These 16 chapters have consumed an important part of her adult lifetime. So we'll look forward to her comments. Again, if you're new with us, I can tell you that what I do is go through and read and highlight. I try to work through the arguments that she makes on any given page and get to the point. You know, she says, well, in the 6th century they thought this about this passage, in the 8th century, in the 13th century. Today we think, and if I think she's right, as far as all that I know, then that's the part that I read to you. Just sort of get to the bottom line of each of these arguments, if you would. Okay, let's pray. God, we hold this book to be the most important book in the whole world. The 66 books within the one big book contain for us the key to life. Life abundant, life everlasting. We, Boston Avenue United Methodists, believe that you worked through very real people in producing this book. People limited by their own time and place, and yet people of great faith who were attuned to the workings of your Holy Spirit, who were able to write down those things that are forever true about you, about your initiating relationship with us, making possible right relationship with us with you, each of us with each other. Help us find those things forever true and apply them to the living of our lives. In Christ's name, amen. Chapter 8. And there are only 16, so we're right at the halfway mark. In those days, when there was again a great crowd without anything to eat, he's already told you about the feeding of the 5,000, he called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd, because they've been with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. Meaning, you see, that they may have brought small lunches with them the first day or two, but it's been 3 days and they're running out. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they will faint on the way, and some of them have come from a great distance. His disciples replied, how can one feed these people with bread here in the desert? He asked them, how many loaves do you have? They said 7. Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd. They had also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. They ate and were filled, and they took up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now, there were about 4,000 people. We're told in the first big gathering about 5,000, and he sent them away. And immediately he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the district of Dalmanutha. Let's see what Dr. Perkins says. Parallels between Mark chapter 6 and Mark chapter 8, these two feedings of the big crowds, have led scholars to suggest that Mark is here incorporating earlier material. That is, that either these are stories that have been passed down through an oral tradition. We know that he's writing about 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Or there may have been other written materials that we simply do not have access to today. Luke, Matthew, John have not been written yet, so we're not talking about those materials, but some other early materials. This entire section, which ends with Jesus healing a blind man after the feeding, leads readers to acknowledge the blindness of Jesus' own disciples. So Mark inserts here this first 10 verses of chapter 8 without a transition to explain how Jesus came to be instructing a large crowd for 3 days. Some interpreters think that the setting of the previous episode, possibly in Gentile territory, was intended as the setting of this story as well. The story's proximity to the encounter with the Syrophoenician woman hints that the crumbs left by the children will be substantial. Now let's go back and just remind ourselves what Dr. Perkins is talking about, because this would make perfectly good sense to you if you had read it immediately following what we were dealing with last week. Remember that most of Jesus' ministry takes place right here around the lake, the Sea of Galilee. That last fateful week of his life, of course, in Jerusalem, but most of it up here in Galilee. He crosses occasionally into Gentile territory. If he goes over to the east bank of the lake or the river, he's in Gentile territory, simply meaning non-Jews. These are Arabs. If he goes north and west, if he goes north and west, then he's moving into what would be modern-day Lebanon. This would be Jordan today. This is Syria today. This is Lebanon today. The port cities up here, Tyre, Sidon. There was much fighting in Tyre, as you recall, just 6 weeks ago. Go up a little farther north, you come to Sidon. And this area, it was called Syro, the prefix coming from Syria, same word. And Phoenicia was an ancient territory just a little bit north here. I reminded you that the Syrophoenicians were the first people, as far as we know, who began coinage, money. People had bartered goods and so on. Syrophoenicians were a very bright people. When Jesus crosses up here into Tyre, Sidon, and where the Syrophoenician woman lived, he's definitely in Gentile territory. Not Arab, but Lebanese, and moving on up into what would be modern-day Turkey. Okay, so these areas up here. So remember Jesus' conversation with the woman. She had a sick child. She asked him to heal her child, and he said, woman, I've come to the children of Israel, if you would, and so you don't give the children's food to dogs. And she said, but even the dogs get to eat the crumbs that fall from the table. Now, what Dr. Perkins is saying is, if Jesus is now teaching in this territory, if he hasn't moved from that point, then 3 days of teaching would be lots of crumbs indeed for non-Jews. That's the point she's making. That he spent a lot of time here if he's not moved, and Mark doesn't say he had moved from that place. Okay, let's go on. Jesus' exchange with the disciples about we don't have enough, how are we going to feed them, enables Mark to underline the great distance people must travel to hear Jesus. Now today, of course, we wouldn't consider these great distances. But if you're walking, they're great distances. Remember that this is a very small area, 50 miles from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. Just 50 miles. That's not very far if you're driving on a modern Israeli highway. Less than an hour as it would be here. But if you're walking, of course, 50 miles is a long way. If you're walking from Capernaum up to Tyre, Sidon, and Syrophoenicia territory, then it would be several days' walk. And if people have walked that far and have now stayed 3 days and they've already run out of food, you get the mentality here of what Mark's trying to convey. Okay, the disciples comment that it's impossible to feed so many people in a desert introduces the element of difficulty. Now, when he says desert, remember that this is a word that's very symbolic and meaningful to the disciples. This is not generally known as desert territory. Desert is south of Jerusalem, down here. South of Jerusalem is desert. Generally, north of Jerusalem is very green. You have rivers that flow not toward the sea, I've told you, but toward the river, because there are some mountainous areas. Part of it's very flat. On down here at the Gaza Strip's very flat. But up farther north, at Haifa, you have Mount Carmel, where Elijah fought the prophets of Baal and so on. The river there flows eastward. Remember when all the blood of the prophets, after he had defeated these 4,000 and put his foot on their neck and cut their heads off, the blood flowed down to the palace of Ahab and Jezebel. So the rivers flow east from here. Anyway, this is not generally seen as desert territory. It's green, fertile, lots of farming up here. But the Jews got close to God in the desert wanderings with Moses and so on. Jesus was close to God when he was tempted by the tempter, the tester, after his baptism in the desert. So it's called desert here, but Mark doesn't know as much about geography of this area. We can tell there are times he doesn't know very much about the geography. So it may simply mean outside the towns. There are no stores here, no markets, no place to trade for food. So in that sense, maybe desert, but not dry and arid like it is south of Jerusalem. Okay. The disciples commented that it's impossible to feed so many people in a desert. Introduces the element of difficulty, how difficult it's going to be. 7 loaves, a few small fish, are blessed and distributed separately. Mark says the crowd eats and is satisfied. The banquet, that there's so much, indicates the abundance of the messianic age that Jesus is bringing in. If we believe he is Messiah, then the celebration has already begun. Okay. By incorporating another version of the feeding story, Mark highlights its significance. I told you last Sunday that of all the miracles Jesus performed, the only one mentioned in all 4 Gospels is the feeding of the 5,000. And here Mark adds a second one. So she's saying Mark highlights the significance of that feeding. Readers are reminded of Jesus' great compassion for the crowds. Mark says Jesus told his disciples, I have great compassion for these people. The geographical progression from crowds who gathered in the populated areas to those who followed him out into the unpopulated areas has been even further intensified by the way Mark tells this story. This crowd followed him into the wilderness and remained there without food for 3 days. Let's go on. Verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to argue with him, asking him for a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, and getting into the boat again, he went across to the other side. So here, Mark tells us he's just healed a very sick child. He has just fed 4,000 more people with a very meager supply of food. And the Pharisees were saying, hey, show us something so we'll really know if you're the Messiah or not. And he just, oh my. She says, after the feeding miracle, the disciples and Jesus go off in a boat. The Sea of Galilee separates Jesus' mission into Jewish and non-Jewish areas. Jesus apparently disembarks at an unknown location and encounters the Pharisees. The Pharisees ask for some form of divine authentication for what he's doing. Readers know that the heavenly sign was already provided when he was baptized. The Holy Spirit descended upon him like a dove and said, This is my beloved Son. Mark's readers, you and I, or his readers, also know that nothing Jesus might say or do can persuade these Pharisees that he is from God. By presenting Jesus' refusal to perform another sign as his rejection of this generation, Mark's account reflects the tradition of Israel in the wilderness. That is, those who first came out of Egypt didn't have faith enough to cross into the promised land, you remember. Moses sent out 12 spies. When they came back, 10 said, we cannot do it. We are like grasshoppers compared to the people who live there. Joshua and Caleb said, we can do it. And God said to Moses, when Moses took the majority report, well, we're going to have to wait till this generation all dies out before we have a new, younger generation who will have the courage and the faith to go in. And surely enough, 40 years later, that generation had died out. Now, this man who once was very young, Joshua, and his buddy Caleb, can lead God's people on across the river. So she thinks Mark is alluding to that same kind of thing. Well, this generation is not going to get it. Maybe the next generation. Okay. Jesus' strong emotional reaction to their demand that he sighed deeply reflects the disbelief that confronts him. So he's meeting with some success. There are large crowds that come out to hear him. How many is large? Mark says 5,000, 4,000. That's pretty large. The scope of the Roman Empire, of course, it's not so large compared to all the others out there. So she says, unless people recognize that God is present, speaking, and acting in this historical Jesus, no form of testimony will persuade them to follow Him. No amount of explanation or evidence can provide that initial evidence of faith. Although Jesus' refusal seems to be harsh, it acknowledges the reality of human freedom. In the end, faith remains a mysterious gift of responding to God's Word. Sometimes we need to walk away from hostile demands for proof of our faith in God. I had one really angry phone call this week and one really angry letter about our new statue. People who are just convinced that not only am I going to hell, but I'm leading all the Jews and Muslims to do the same by implying that they have any kind of faith in the one true and real God. Nobody meets with success all the time. Nobody is accepted all the time. Some weeks when I'm calling night after night, I have so many wonderful conversations, and then I get to a week where I just get beaten up all week long. This week was one of those. I really had a hard week with my calling, and I would think this person was so close, and that person was so close, and this couple so close to making a decision of faith, and it's the same old. Well, I'm thinking about it. Well, I don't want to do something I don't really believe in. And you don't really believe? Well, sort of, not really, and all sorts of things. It's discouraging. In the end, faith remains a mysterious gift. Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, the three greatest gifts of God's Holy Spirit are, and he listed first, faith. Faith is a gift. Some just don't get it. People ask me, and particularly, was seminary a startling kind of revelation to you? Did they take away all your faith before building it back? And I said, no, I don't know. Maybe I'm sort of simple-minded about these things. Faith has not been a huge struggle for me. I don't understand always why God does what God does or doesn't do when I wish God would. But it's really not a question for me of, is there a God or not? Or even, does God care or not? Those questions got answered for me a long time ago, and they don't really surface again. I do believe there is one true God. I do believe He's revealed Himself most clearly in Jesus of Nazareth. And I do believe the very nature and essence of this God is love. I just don't understand always how that works, but I'm willing to wait and see how that all plays out. Because I'm committed to what I believe. Okay, let's go on. Verse 14. Now the disciples had forgotten to bring any bread. Remember in Mark's gospel, these guys are doofuses, okay? They aren't really sharp. Mark almost gives you the impression, what was Jesus thinking about when He called these 12? Because they just don't seem to get it. Here they get caught off again and again and again with nothing to eat. You'd think after a while they'd pack a lunch. Well, they've forgotten to bring any bread. They had only one loaf with them in the boat. One loaf. And loaf here probably means pita bread. Probably one little round tortilla, flour tortilla sort of thing. He cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod. They said to one another, he said that because we have no bread. And becoming aware of it, that they're mumbling and whispering, Jesus said to them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes and fail to see? Do you have ears and fail to hear? Do you not remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said 12. And the 7 for the 4,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? And they said, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? Okay, let me just mention before we go on to what she wants to say. Dr. Brandon Scott reminded us when he was our Barton Clinton Gordy presenter that for us, yeast is good, basically. We think of yeast as being good. When I was in seminary at SMU in Dallas, Mrs. Baird's Bakery was right across the street from the south end of the campus. And the theology school is right down on the south end of the campus. So I would work long hours in the library at night, working on a term paper, doing so on. And I would come to our little one-room apartment. It was in a married couple's dorm right there on the campus. 100 yards from the library is where Gail and I slept every night. And so I'd often say to her, I am so hungry. You want to go over to Ms. Baird's and take the tour? And sometimes she'd say yes and sometimes no. And if she said no, I'd try to get one of the other guys, a student, to go with me. And we went to take a tour of Ms. Baird so many times that they finally just said, you know how to do it. And we'd, walk the little yellow trail and get to the end where the hot loaves are coming out. And they just cut a whole loaf down the middle and then cut it once. And everybody that had taken the tour got a fourth of a loaf of bread slathered with butter. And it was wonderful. The yeast smelled so good. When they were baking early in the evening, because the bread trucks run early the next morning, when we're baking, you know how yeast smells. It's wonderful. And when we think of yeast, we usually think how good it smells. But that's not the way it was perceived in Jesus' time. It usually was seen as something rotten. It was something strange working in the dough. This little bubbling and bubbling of active yeast and so on, they thought was not good. Purity was no leavening as at Passover. No leavening. So when he says, beware of the leavening of the Pharisees and of Herod, he is saying these people are not out for your well-being. Let's go on and see what she says about that. 3 sea incidents, and we're not talking about the Mediterranean, we're talking about the lake, depict the decline in the disciples' ability to perceive who Jesus really is. The first 2 were miracles demonstrating that Jesus did in fact possess God's power. References in this 3rd episode to the earlier feeding stories make the disciples' understanding of Jesus' saying particularly obtuse. Although readers expect disbelief from the Pharisees, the lack of understanding demonstrated by his own disciples make it appear that they are also part of this unbelieving generation. Mark makes sure that the reader knows the disciples have 1 loaf of bread, even though they act as though they have none. Now Jesus asks them twice if they have not yet perceived or understood. Jesus saying in verse 15 could stand as an independent warning against the influence of the Pharisees. The phrase, "and of Herod," may recall the opinions Herod expressed earlier about Jesus' identity. Some manuscripts recognize the difficulty and amend Herod to Herodians, followers after the king. The Pharisees and Herodians have been sworn enemies of Jesus from the beginning of this gospel. You can read it in chapter 3. Leaven or yeast frequently carry negative overtones in the Bible, since it was thought to work by creating decay in the dough. Passover observance required cleansing the home of all traces of leaven. I've told you that strict practitioners of the Jewish Torah in Israel actually come out in the street and throw their toothbrushes into the trash. Anything that might have the least little bit of leavening, you go buy a new toothbrush when you come to Passover and so on. It's ritually in front of their neighbors and so on. They even have, in the Hasidic neighborhoods, they have big pots, cauldrons of boiling water, so that you can show your neighbors that you are in fact cleansing everything you have of any yeast. You put your dishes and your silverware and so on into these big cauldrons of water and haul them out again so that all your neighbors can see you're getting all the yeast out of your house. Jesus rebukes the disciples for their hard-heartedness. His query, "Do you have eyes and fail to see?" Perhaps the disciples have been corrupted by the leaven of Jesus' opponents. Maybe the Pharisees and the Herodians have just sort of worn them down, that they cannot see the good of the 5,000, the good of the feeding of the 4,000, the good of all these healings. They've decided, somehow. And it's easy to do. Dr. Charles Allen used to tell me, when you get an anonymous letter, just throw that thing away immediately. If the person doesn't have the courage to sign, throw it away immediately. And I've tried doing that through the years. I do throw them away. But if you've seen the words, you can't forget them entirely. And people who write anonymous letters know that. You can't completely forget. And there are always naysayers around. In any organization, there are always people who are negative. We hopefully always have more who are positive, encouraging, but we have, there's certain people who write to me from time to time. And I know when I see this familiar name, what kind of letter it's going to be. I know. And those that I know always encourage me. I look forward to, taking my little letter opener and getting to this note right away, because I know she's going to say something kind or he's going to be encouraging. I have one World War II vet, a pilot, World War II, who's now physically not able to be here. He writes to me almost every week. He occasionally misses a week, almost every week, and I answer him every week. He writes me a little handwritten note, and it's always, that was the best one. After 26 years, that was the best one you've ever done. And I write to him week after week and say, God love you. You help me. Your letter gets to me when I'm writing on this week's sermon, and you help me. I hope you know that, because he apologizes that it just can't get there anymore. And I write to him and say, your letter gets to me, and it always helps me. You are an encourager, and I love you for being my encourager. And then there are others that I know what their notes, I don't know what the content this time, but I know it's going to be something negative. Maybe the disciples were listening to the wrong people. That's probably what Jesus means. Beware of the leavening of the Pharisees and the Herodians, the followers after this king. They will pull you down. If you hang around negative people long enough, they will pull you down. Let's go on. Verse 22. They came to Bethsaida. Now, notice that when I say these words, I come to B-E-T-H. I don't say the H sound because the Jews don't say an H sound. And there are numbers of languages that do not have the TH sound. German doesn't have a TH sound. They usually substitute or would use a D instead of a TH. So with the Jews. So it's Bethlehem, and it's Bethsaida. Now, Bethsaida was one of the Decapolis, one of the 10 communities around the lake. It didn't survive. It's not existent today, but it was one of those 10. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." Okay, so here's what Dr. Perkins says. This healing story is at the center of 3 miracles. Mark tells you 1, 2, 3 that deal with the senses. We had a deaf man in chapter 7, a blind man now at Bethsaida, and in chapter 10 we will come to blind Bartimaeus just outside of Jericho on Jesus' fateful trip to Jerusalem. The questions with which Jesus challenged his disciples in the previous episode provide a symbolic dimension to the healing of eyes that fail to see and ears that fail to hear. You see what she's saying? She's just told, she is saying, Mark, has just told you a story about Jesus healing a man who's deaf. So now he has ears that hear. He's healed a blind man now, so he has eyes that see. These two are contrasted with the disciples, who have ears that don't hear and eyes that don't see. Jesus can help them hear and help them see if they will be open to the working of God's Spirit among them in and through Jesus of Nazareth. If not, they will continue to have ears that don't hear and eyes that don't see. That's the point. Can Jesus heal those who are deaf and blind to the rule of God, as he has done for those who are physically afflicted? This episode is similar to the healing of the deaf man, in that Jesus takes the man aside and touches the afflicted eyes with saliva. He also sends the man home with a command to avoid going into the village, apparently a variation on earlier commands to tell no one. Tell no one. Remember why that is so? He sees his primary role as teaching. Torah means instruction or teaching, and he says he's come to teach Israel, to teach them. These healing things keep happening because they're people who have needs, and he has great compassion for them. He has to keep multiplying food so that they can eat when he sees they could faint on the way home. But the real purpose is teaching. Teaching. We have educators always with us here. I saw one, you've probably seen this before, but I saw a quotation and I liked it so much I've written it down for the title of a sermon next year where I think this will really fit. You've always heard the old thing, those who can do. And this one said, and those who believe others can teach. I love that. Those who believe others can teach. I love that. Mark's use of this story as a commentary on Jesus' relationship with the disciples leads many interpreters to suggest that the double healing reflects the process that will be necessary to overcome their blindness. Do you understand what she's saying? Jesus laid his hands on the man and said, "Can you see?" He said, "I see people, but not clearly," saying they appear to be like trees walking. Let's try again. And he puts his hands on him again. And then he says, "Now look, I see them." So Dr. Famie Perkins is saying, Mark may be saying, there's still hope for the disciples. They're not getting much of it yet. But maybe if they stay close and Jesus keeps touching them, they will see a little better and a little better. The Wesleys called this the process of sanctification. That is, by God's grace, we come to moments of justification, as both Wesley brothers had this heartwarming experience. Charles first, and a few nights later, John. This heartwarming experience where John would write, "I felt that my sins, even mine, had been forgiven, and I was set right with God." Those are justifying moments when nothing stands between you and God. But the Wesleys also said, in that very same moment that you sense God has set you right with him once more, God begins to turn you. The old Hebrew idea of repentance, not just being sorry, but being willing to be turned. And God begins the process of sanctification. Here's the old Latin word sanctus, holy. Only one is truly holy, Jesus said, and that is God. But we become more like the Holy One as he gradually turns us a little more, a little more, a little more. NASA talks about mid-course corrections from time to time. They blast a rocket off from Cape Canaveral. It's headed toward, back years ago, the moon. And they're saying now, hopefully we'll go to the moon again. And they had mid-course corrections. With the best information and data they had, they sent the rocket in one way. Well, now just a little bit of energy, turn it this way, a little bit that way to get to the destination. That's what Dr. Perkins is saying here. Is this what Mark is trying to convey with telling this story? Here was a man who was healed in degrees, if you would. Not completely the first time, much better the second time. Maybe for the disciples, maybe they will be healed a little more and see and hear a little better as time goes on. Today, many blind people are able to function independently, Ancient societies lacked the services and education that make this quality of life possible. Blind persons had to be led everywhere by others. This man is led to Jesus by friends and then led apart by Jesus. But once cured, he can depart for home on his own. Doesn't have to go back in the village. Doesn't have to rely on anyone. Now he can function. Okay, verse 27. Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist. Others, Elijah. Still others, one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Now, those of you who've been to Israel, let me remind you where Caesarea Philippi is. Okay, the last story, just before this one, took place at Bethsaida, which was one of the towns of the Decapolis. And now it says Jesus took his disciples and went up to Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi is north of the lake. Okay. These are the Golan Heights taken by the Jews from the Syrians in the 67 war and still under Jewish control. There's a demilitarized zone all along here where you can see UN troops. Anytime you're up here in the Golan Heights, you can see these white vehicles marked very clearly UN on them. That's what they're trying to establish now on the Lebanese border as well. Some kind of demilitarized zone patrolled by the United Nations to hopefully avoid what happened 2 months ago up there that brought on more serious fighting. Right up near the border is this place called Caesarea Philippi. Now, it was a town, and if you look at the two names for it, you can tell that it's had non-Jewish influence here. Philippi, Philip for you and me. There was a very famous Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great. This spot is where clear waters bubble up. Thousands of gallons of clear water. They come from the snows that fall on Mount Hermon. From here, the Golan Heights, you can see Mount Hermon up in Syria. It's right near Damascus. It's a very tall mountain. I think around 14,000 feet, sort of like Pikes Peak. Snows fall on it and eventually melt, of course, in the hot summers and go underground. And they flow through these limestone areas like you have down in Texas. You have quite a few of them down around San Marcos and so on, where they bubble up in this clear, clear water. That's what you have at Caesarea Philippi. And as this water, bubbles up, it begins the Jordan River. The waters flow south. And so in this beautiful little river, the beginning of the river, you see trout swimming this long. Some of the biggest fig trees I've ever seen in my life. They have unearthed now a shrine to the god Pan, Greek, god of music, celebration. Okay. The Greeks had used this place. Later the Romans knew about it. Caesarea, another word for Caesar. Caesarea Philippi. So this had not been primarily Jewish territory. Greeks had it. Romans have control of it and so on. Jesus can take his disciples up there and get out of the crowds. First time we saw that in 1983, there was virtually nothing there. Just the water, basically. There was a meager parking area, and there was no other bus there when our bus pulled up. Just the 40 of us, whatever it was, could get out and see the waters by ourselves, have quiet time there. And each time we've been back, they've added more and more stuff now. This is a very special place for Christians, not for Jews. A very special place for us Christians. And so we love to go to Caesarea Philippi. And one time we ate lunch at a restaurant right there beside the river where it begins. It's very green up there, beautiful green trees and so on, and it's lush area. Okay, that's where they've gone. Let's see what Dr. Perkins has to say. Back in the 6th chapter, Mark described the opinions about Jesus held by those associated with Herod, people who had only heard of Jesus by reputation. Herod himself adopted the incorrect opinion that the reader knows is closest to the truth Is this John the Baptist who's come back from the dead? Well, not really, but you're on the right track. Now, Jesus asked the disciples about the common opinion of who he is. After all that's happened so far, who do you hear people thinking I am? They repeat the views already listed in the previous episode. Some say you're John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah. Elijah, remember, was supposed to return just before Messiah. So they're close, you see. John the Baptizer is that Elijah, if you would, and Jesus is the real thing. But some are still saying, well, maybe it's John the Baptist come back from the dead. Maybe it is Elijah and Messiah's coming. And some others say, well, he's a good prophet. One of many. Jesus then puts the same question to the disciples. So what do you think? And Peter says, you are the Messiah. This confession is the first correct human statement about Jesus' identity in the Gospel of Mark. It's Simon who says it first. The setting for the episode is awkward. It says, into the village of Philip's Caesarea. Although the region was 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, so see if you can imagine this beginning the Mediterranean, this being the Jordan River, about half of that, so, that's pretty close, about 25 miles north. Each time we've been, our tour guide directs us up this really winding little road up to the Golan Heights. Seems to take a good long while to get there, and I always think, oh, Lord, it's going to take us that long to get back. No, there's really a very fancy highway, boom, back down to the Sea of Galilee. But they want you to see the Golan Heights and what they were able to take in the year 67. And they also show you some farms as you go along. I mean, you see them, and they tell you these are the fat cows of Bashan mentioned in the Bible. Green grass, and the cows really get nice, big. The fat cows of Bashan. And there are people farming up there. It's a pretty area, and now it's been a part of Israel since 1967. But basically, very windy little road for 25 miles, and then boom, right back down a very modern highway when you do get through seeing Caesarea Philippi. Mark shows no interest in the Gentile character of the region, not for his purposes in telling the story this time. Caesarea Philippi was built by Herod Philip as the capital of his tetrarchy. Perhaps its distance, 2 days' journey for people accustomed to walking, 12.5 miles a day, that'd be a pretty hefty walk. And northern location served to isolate Jesus and his disciples from the crowds. The term Messiah in Hebrew, or Christos, Christ in Greek, was used as a confession of who Jesus really was. Anointing represents God's affirmation that the prophet, priest, or king is the divinely chosen leader of the people. And the word Messiah, the word Christ, both mean the anointed one. The silence that they not tell concludes this episode, applying explicitly to the confession that Jesus, skipped a page here, is Messiah. The crucified and risen Jesus is the only one who can be designated Kyrios. It's the word we have in the mosaic in the south end of the Great Hall. I wanted one word there, one word in the other. The one word in the north, mosaic, God is revealed in the Hebrew Scriptures. The name given to Moses at the burning bush. Not literally. It isn't the Eye Asher Eye. You can tell it's a short little word. Out of deference to the Jews. We have Jews who come here for funerals, for weddings, for baptisms of some of their Gentile friends' children. We have Jewish guests in our building from time to time. And they don't say the name. So we didn't write the name. We wrote in Hebrew. I even got Rabbi Sherman to write it for me. And we sent his writing to Venice, Italy, to be sure that they got it exactly right. It's the word Adonai. The Lord. Okay. But all Jews would know it is the word they say that means the Eye Asher Eye, the I am who I am. And down in the opposite end we have the Greek word Kyrios. And it's used only of Jesus, appropriately at least. Only of Jesus. He is the very same stuff as the God of Israel who appeared to Moses in the burning bush and so on. Okay, so that's what she's saying here. This is the appropriate title for Jesus of Nazareth. The problem with the confession is the inappropriateness of the time. That is, Mark thinks no one can really know this until the cross and resurrection. So Peter says the right words, but we'll see that even Peter stumbles and falls miserably after this. So you can't really have it sort of burned into your heart until you see the way he died, and that he did die, was willing to die, and that God raised him. So, she says, most Christians today find Christological titles like Messiah and Son of God so shop-worn, we say them so often, but they do not convey any real expectations. We should think of Messiah, Son of God, Son of Man, as code words for stories of how salvation comes to be present in a human being, Mary's child Jesus. God chooses unlikely persons to convey salvation. Both Son of Man and Son of God link Jesus with the heavenly world. Although the designation Son of God may have been used of a human figure, Mark presents it as God's word about Jesus of Nazareth. Son of Man is associated with exaltation, vindication, and final judgment. God became present to and among human beings in Jesus, Son of God. As exalted Son of Man, the one who was manifested in Jesus is the norm by which we judge or evaluate all things. And here she picks up on the word norm, which is the one Paul Tillich used a half century ago. The norm of theological truth, that is, truth about God, is the Bible. But even the norm needs a norm, he said. A norma normans in Latin, a norm that norms the norm, and that's Jesus of Nazareth. That for followers after Jesus as Christ, long-awaited Messiah of God, every other part of this holy book can be judged, if you would. Is this true about God as we know Him in Jesus Christ? Let's go a little farther. Verse 31. Then, right after Peter's confession here that he is the Christ, he is the Messiah, Jesus began to teach them that this Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the scribes, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, that is Jesus, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, tester, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." Okay, she says, Dr. Perkins, a saying about the suffering Son of Man sparks an exchange between Jesus and Peter. This episode concludes with a rebuke. The parallelism between the rebuke in verse 30, not to tell anyone, and verse 33, get behind me, tester, for you are setting your mind not on divine things but on human things, suggests that the second rebuke explains the first. That is, when Peter hears Jesus explain that the Son of Man, the Messiah, is going to be a sufferer, not one who overthrows the Romans, not one who rides the black stallion, but one who will eventually ride a burro with his toes dragging the ground. He's saying, you see, Peter doesn't know what he's saying. He says the right words, but he doesn't know what he's saying because he's not going to see in Jesus the Messiah when he starts suffering. And it's only after he's really dead and has been raised that one has the right to say, I embrace him as Messiah, even though he was not the kind we were looking for. Understand where she's going with this? When Peter hears Jesus explain that the Son of Man must suffer, Peter has the audacity to take him aside and rebuke him. That's not what's going to happen to our Messiah. Since the word for rebuke has been used to refer to demons, Jesus rebukes demons, Peter appears to have fallen into the same trap as Jesus' relatives. He's going to get him straightened out. His relatives came to Capernaum to take him home. He's not well. He thinks Jesus has lost his mind and needs to be exorcised. That's why Mark keeps using these same words. Jesus has a demon, it seems, here. No one thinks the Messiah is going to suffer and die. Even without the sharp language, anyone growing up in a traditional society would be horrified to observe a disciple taking this tone with his teacher. Jesus' swift reaction, even called Peter the Satan, is appropriate after a student so confronts a teacher. It wasn't done in the first century. Clearly, Peter attaches significance to the title Messiah, but only if it excludes suffering. The sudden reference to suffering certainly seems out of place to the disciples. The imperative word must. We must go down to Jerusalem. The Son of Man must suffer many things and die. Conveys the idea of a divinely established plan. Jesus suffers out of obedience to God. This necessity is grounded in God and cannot be evaded. The prediction establishes a pattern that will play an increasingly important part in these last chapters of Mark. That is, Jesus' ability to predict what will happen to himself and to his disciples. Knowledge of the circumstances of one's own death was a sign of wisdom, a gift of extraordinary persons in the Greco-Roman world. Given the fate of John the Baptist and the unrelenting hostility of religious leaders in Jerusalem during Jesus' last days, the historical probability that he spoke of his own death and sought to understand it within the context of the coming of God's kingdom is very high. That is, he could see. Peter's protest may express a struggle that Jesus himself underwent in confronting his fate. Certainly he seemed to be confronting it yet that Thursday night in the garden. The editorial comment that Jesus told them this boldly or directly removes any suspicion that Jesus' death took him by surprise. A few more sentences here. This episode does not explain how or why the death of Jesus lies at the heart of God's great plan of salvation. Not yet. Readers know that Jesus can control even the winds on the sea. How can he permit his enemies who wish to destroy him to succeed, as though they had already succeeded in destroying John the Baptizer? Confronted with the necessity of suffering, most people react exactly like Peter did. In a painkiller culture like ours, a balanced understanding of suffering is difficult to achieve. Jesus sets out the challenge for us to think as God does, not as human beings normally do. God does not delight in human suffering. Yet danger lies in concluding that suffering and self-sacrifice are always undesirable. Prayer is important in healing, but prayer is an opening up of ourselves to what God wills, not an exercise in forcing God to do our will. Let's go a little farther. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what would it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of whom the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." And he said to them, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." Dr. Perkins says, Jesus summons the crowd. This act represents a striking reversal of the usual pattern in which he is withdrawing from crowds. He says a disciple must take up the cross, must be willing to lose his or her life if called upon. The picture of a condemned criminal carrying the crossbar to the place of execution forms a shocking requirement for following Jesus. "Whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in his glory." Fidelity, faithfulness to Jesus brings persecution because the disciples live in an age that is contrary to belief in one true God. The adjectives evil and adulterous echo the words of the Old Testament prophets. Isaiah chapter 1, chapter 21, Jeremiah chapter 3 calls their generation the same thing. Those who confess Jesus to be Messiah and Son of God must be faithful disciples. Later in Mark's writing, readers learn that the sons of Zebedee are to be martyred. They will be put to death. It will not be easy to keep following Jesus. Christians will have to stand trial because they preach the gospel. He will tell you in chapter 13 when we get to it. Those who remain faithful can be confident they will be among the elect at the judgment if they remain faithful. But those who are ashamed of Jesus, that is, who accept the judgment of a wicked and adulterous age, will discover that their Savior treats them in the same way at the end time. A little bit more. The disciples have participated in Jesus' ministry of preaching and healing. Now they discover they will also participate in the ministry of suffering if they stay around. Anyone who attempts to call the world to account before the gospel must be ready to sacrifice self-interest. The gospel calls us to deny self in order to be more like Christ. The church continues to be a martyr in many places in the world. In our day, those Christians who work to bring justice and peace to suffering peoples around the world are often victims of the violence they're trying to end. One Roman Catholic nun this week, for example, who was gunned down in the back as she worked at a hospital. In addition to solidarity with the martyr church, Christians should consider whether there are situations in which public pressure may lead them to deny their faith. We may feel that pressure at any age. Many adults know that Christian faith is not always welcome in the workplace, so they learn to cloak their Christian identity when morally questionable practices seem to be the order of the day. I love this little quotation. I've read this in Fred Craddock's own work, but this Roman Catholic woman theologian likes it too. I remind you that Fred Craddock was one of our Barton Clinton Gordy presenters a long time ago, 30 years ago, but still living, retired now, in Atlanta, Georgia. As Fred Craddock pointed out in an address to pastors, the reality for most Christians in this country is seldom a life and death situation. This is his quote. We think giving our all to the Lord is like taking $1,000 bill and laying it on the table and saying, "Here's my life, Lord. I'm giving it all." But the reality for most of us is that He sends us to the bank and has us cash in the $1,000 bill for a bag full of quarters. Most of us in the United States go through life putting out 25 cents here and 50 cents there. Usually giving our life to Christ is not glorious. It's done in all those little acts of love, 25 cents at a time. All right. We'll pick up there next week, chapter 9, verse 2. That was a long chapter. We can do more next week.